Welcome to General Anatomy and Physiology. Today we'll be discussing the digestive system. Our agenda today is to review some terminology for the digestive system, review the oral cavity, the alimentary canal, and what that pertains to, as well as the different layers that we would find structurally composing of the alimentary canal, the process of deglutition, which is also known as swallowing, and also review the stomach and the stomach secretions and how do we regulate the secretions of the stomach. So we're going to start by some terminology here that we will hear brought up throughout not only this online lecture but also face-to-face lecture as well. The first term there is ingestion, and the definition of this is basically introduction of food into the oral cavity. Ingestion, introduction of food into the oral cavity. Mastication is the process of chewing. Peristalsis is the process of movement of food or a bolus, as we will find out, through the alimentary canal. So peristalsis is the movement of food or a bolus, and I'll explain what a bolus is a little bit later in this unit here. Mixing is pretty self-explanatory. We mix things back and forth in a particular area of our digestive system, and that would only be mainly concentrated at the stomach is where we see the mixing taking place. Secretion is the release or secretion of different products from our digestive system. Some examples of things that would be secreted would be enzymes, and enzymes will be needed, as you will see, in order to break different chemical components down in our digestive system. Digestion is the mechanical and or chemical breakdown of our food. Absorption, well, this is where we are absorbing products in our digestive system into either the blood supply or also into the lymphatic system. Obviously, when we're talking about absorbing, it's that of nutrients that our body does need. And then anything that we do not absorb, we would eliminate. And elimination is brought through defecation. We're going to start with the oral cavity. Basically, we're going to work our way down from the oral cavity all the way through our esophagus, our stomach, our small, large intestinal tract. We'll just get to the stomach here today on our online presentation, and the rest of it will be face-to-face. The functions of the oral cavity would be ingestion, obviously the introduction of food into the oral cavity. Once that happens, we do begin the process of digestion, which is the breakdown of the food in our oral cavity, and that does happen immediately. Most of the time we think of digestion in the stomach, but actually it does take place here. Remember, the definition of digestion was the mechanical and or chemical breakdown of food. Mechanically speaking, mastication is chewing of the food, so we're mechanically breaking it down that way. And we will talk a little bit about the chemicals that, and when I say chemicals, most of the time I'm referring to enzymes, but there are some other chemicals involved here as we move through. But chemicals are basically chemicals that are breaking down our food. So we do see some of this taking place as well. And we'll look at what those chemicals or enzymes are a bit later. Obviously, we need our oral cavity for speech, swallowing, as well as taste. Looking in our oral cavity, we also have the teeth. We have primary or deciduous teeth, which are basically your baby teeth, sometimes called the milk teeth. Milk, M-I-L-K. When we're babies, we have 20 of those when fully grown. Obviously, we lose some of those teeth, and eventually we have our permanent teeth fully developed at 32, and again this number 32 is if obviously you have never had any teeth taken out for braces or wisdom teeth taken out, or some people's wisdom teeth never even grow in. So that number is obviously very textbook, if you will. We also have the salivary glands. We have the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual. Let me just show you a picture of those. Parotid salivary gland is just anterior to the ear. This is the largest one that you would see here. Underneath the mandible is the submandibular gland, and then underneath the tongue is a sublingual gland. Now you notice that each one of those has different ducts that are running from that into the oral cavity, and their job, their function, as you see right here, is to release saliva. In fact, as humans, we produce anywhere from 1 liter to 1.5 liters of saliva per day, so quite a bit. Now, what exactly is saliva? Most of it, as you can see here, is that of water. 99.4%, give or take, is water. And that's just to basically moisten the food that we're chewing and getting it basically prepared for swallowing. There are some enzymes that we'll find in the saliva. Remember, enzymes are chemicals that break down other chemicals or speed up reactions. Amylase is one of those. Amylase is important for the breakdown of carbohydrates, and lipase is important for the breakdown of lipids or fats. So immediately in our oral cavity, we're starting that chemical process of breakdown as well. There is some mucus that is mixed in with this composition as well. So when we look at the function of the saliva, obviously like we talked about just a minute ago, to moisten and lubricate the food and again prepare it for swallowing. Digestion process, remember digestion is a mechanical or breakdown, so these chemical breakdown here of these amylase and lipase are going to help with that. And also, saliva will help with killing bacteria because there are antibodies. Antibody IgA, immunoglobulin A antibody is in there, as well as some lysozymes, which are going to help break down and destroy anything that may not be wanted within the oral cavity. Now, the salivary glands themselves are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So if you remember back to the autonomic nervous system, this was the involuntary nervous system, and either you have sympathetic or you have parasympathetic. So if you remember, sympathetic was our fight or flight, and parasympathetic was our rest and digest state, if you will. So if we recall back to that, most of the time we're in the parasympathetic nervous division, and we're comfortable, we're relaxed, we're not being threatened. And at that point, our oral cavity is very well lubricated. It has lots of saliva production. But the time that you get very nervous, let's say you're going to give a speech, your mouth goes completely dry, and this is because you switch from that parasympathetic over to the sympathetic nervous system. You're feeling very threatened, if you will, and your salivary glands completely shut down and no longer producing saliva, and therefore you get this cotton mouth or dry mouth, if you will. So under most circumstances, our salivary glands are under the parasympathetic control, but they can easily switch over to the sympathetic when in threat mode. The alimentary canal or tract is basically everything from the esophagus all the way down through your anus. So your esophagus, your stomach, your small and your large intestinal tract is what we consider to be the alimentary canal or tract. It doesn't matter which one of those organs you're looking at. They all have 4 basic layers or tunics. You have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa or adventitia, and you can see those listed right here. Now, what's unique about these, the mucosa layer that you see here in like a gold color, this is the layer that's releasing mucus, because remember the digestive system is a mucus-lined membrane all the way through, and so this mucus has to come from somewhere. So there's cells that will be lining in part of this mucosa layer that are releasing this mucus. There's also different types of absorptive cells there that produce enzymes and absorb nutrients, and this is basically the one layer that has contact with the food, if you will, as it's traveling through your body. Now the submucosa is on top of the mucosa layer right here in blue. What's unique about this layer is there's lots of blood vessels, glands, and nerves there. In fact, when our nutrients are absorbed, this is the layer that's going to basically transport those nutrients throughout our body to be used. Next, you have the muscularis layer, as we saw in our last picture here in red. There's various different types of muscles around our alimentary canal. This is only showing us 2 different muscle groups, or muscles, if you will. The stomach has 3 different muscle groups. That's not really the concern here. I'm more concerned about what it does. This is the type of muscle that we find here is smooth muscle, and it aids in helping the food move through their alimentary canal. And movement of food through that alimentary canal is referred to as peristalsis. The serosa or the adventitia layer is the very outside layer, as you can see right here, of the alimentary canal. And this is, if I took you in the cadaver room, this is the layer that you would see. It has several different names. We could call it the serosa, as you see here, the adventitia, or we could even call it the visceral peritoneum. If you remember back to visceral versus parietal, visceral is always the very top layer that's covering the organ, if you will. And its job is to release fluid to help with reduction of friction and lubricate that. Now, the bolus. What is this bolus? Well, the bolus is, after you swallow your food, we no longer call it food. We call it a bolus. And basically, a bolus is a chewed up, mashed up, moistened food, if you will, that's being swallowed and moving through the alimentary canal. So the bolus is what's moving through the alimentary canal. We don't really call it food, we don't call it nutrients, we just call it the bolus. And as that bolus is traveling through, there's lots of things working on it, trying to break it down and extract the nutrients and obviously get rid of anything our bodies do not need. So with that process of swallowing, if you will, it's called deglutition. Swallowing is deglutition. And there's 3 different phases to it. We have a voluntary phase, which is just where you're obviously, you introduce the food into your oral cavity, and you can obviously voluntarily swallow this, or involuntary. There's no such thing as involuntarily swallowing this. Either you can chew it up and swallow it, or you can spit it out. So that's your first phase, pretty easy. Now the pharyngeal phase is a reflex, and so which means you don't really have a lot of control over this. Now where this happens is in the esophagus, if you will. I'm going to go to this next page here, and you can see number 3 right here. Well, let me just start up here, I guess. You can see number 1, you're chewing it. This yellow blob here would be the bolus, as you can see here. So this is you voluntarily doing this. Would be the voluntary phase, and then you push it back, and it goes into this pharyngeal phase. It's down here in the pharynx, which you remember the pharynx is the throat, and this is a reflex. So a few different things that are happening here in the pharyngeal phase. First of all, there's a sphincter that's going to relax in the upper esophagus, because it's basically the sphincter is ready for the food to move into the esophagus. The epiglottis is going to tip posteriorly to guard the food from going into the windpipe or the larynx and the trachea, if you will. And then also the uvula, if we go over here, you can see the uvula here is going to get pushed up to guard that bolus from going up through the nasal cavity. So this is the pharyngeal phase. It's happening in the pharynx. Now once it gets past the pharynx, as you can see here, and down into the esophagus, then we have the esophageal phase, which is also a reflex. Meaning it's moving in the direction of the stomach, and it's going to do that via peristaltic contractions. So peristalsis is the movement of this bolus through the alimentary canal, and the way that I describe it is if you had a giant Mr. Freezy Pop and you had this ice at the end of it, and you wanted to get that ice out without tipping it over. How would you get it out? You would basically squeeze a little section at a time, and that ice would move up towards the top and obviously to your mouth. So think about your esophagus. Think about your small and large intestinal tract. They're kind of like Mr. Freezy Pops. And in order to get that bolus there, we have to squeeze or contract different little sections of that esophagus at a time, so this bolus can move from one section to another. And that's what basically peristalsis is. And so in the esophageal phase, the bolus is moving via peristalsis towards the stomach. Just some trivia there. It takes about 9 seconds for actual food, hard substance, if you will, to move to the stomach, and about 2 to 3 seconds for liquid. So the esophagus's role is just that, just to transport the food to the stomach, or the bolus to the stomach. There are glands there that are constantly secreting it, making it moistened, and again we talked about peristalsis and how that works. And then finally we have the stomach. The job of the stomach is I call it the big house. It's there to help mix things back and forth. Does it absorb anything? We're going to talk a little bit about that. I think there's a misnomer out there that people think it absorbs everything, and it's quite contrary to that. It does help with the breakdown of the bolus, and also releasing some gastric juices / enzymes that we're going to talk about. So the stomach does have 3 muscle layers, if you will, and again, this is the job of the muscularis layer, is to mix this food back and forth. And with the help of the gastric juices that we would find in there, the ultimate job of the stomach is really to break down this bolus. Now, the stomach does absorb some things, but not probably what you would think. It mainly absorbs water and alcohol, not your proteins, your carbs, or your fats as much as you would see those other things. Your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins are going to mainly be absorbed within your small intestinal tract. So here's the stomach. It has all the different parts of it that we'll learn in lab. You can see the 3 different muscle layers here. Again, do not remember the names of the muscles. That's not going to make an impact here, but you can see that the muscles are arranged in a different fashion. In order for that, as they contract in different fashions so that the bolus moves back and forth here. You can see this picture here showing us the mixing action of it going back and forth, and basically again the mixing is the mechanical breakdown of the bolus. Now chyme is what chyme is basically the partially digested food or bolus in the stomach, along with the gastric juices that we would see in there as well. It's a very acidic, pasty nature in there that we would see. We'll talk a little bit about how acidic the stomach is a bit later. And then obviously the mixing part, which we were talking about as well. Now the stomach also has rugae, and if we look back a few slides here, the rugae would be the folds that we would find within the stomach. Now rugae are folds that will basically help expand the stomach when needed. And also within that we find surface mucus cells, if you will, and these are obviously there to produce mucus, but also it helps with self-digestion. Mucus cells are going to help with the production of mucus, which help with self-digestion. The pH in the stomach is very low. It's at about a 2 on the pH scale, which means it's very acidic. There needs to be something there to protect the cells of the stomach to not break down. And so what the mucus cells do is they secrete mucus. Now mucus is an alkaline component compared to the pH of the stomach, which is very acidic. So we need that mucus there to buffer, if you will, the high acidity that we find within the stomach. Now the rugae folds are one thing. Now the gastric pits or glands and cells that we find here is a completely different thing. We have some other cells called mucous neck cells, which are different from surface mucus cells. There's not a whole lot of difference there, just basically location. Then we have parietal cells and chief cells. So let me just give you a peek at this picture here. So here is the very top. This is the liner of our stomach right here, and these would be the rugae folds way up here. Now these things that run deep into the mucosa layer here, these are the gastric pits. These are not the same thing as the rugae folds. Okay, these go deep into the mucosa layer. Underneath the mucosa layer is your submucosa. There's your muscularis. You can see the 1, 2, 3 different muscles, and then you have your serosa adventitia or visceral peritoneum. So there's your 3 layers of the alimentary canal. Now within this gastric pit, though, you can see there are many different cells. Up here would be the surface mucus cells that we were talking about, secrete mucus. Down here is the mucous neck cells, are in the neck of this gastric pit. They secrete mucus, so there's nothing different there. Then we have the chief cell and we have the parietal cell. Now what's so unique about these cells here? If you go back, the parietal cell releases hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor, whereas the chief cell secretes pepsinogen, which then becomes pepsin. Let me explain. Go up here, right here. Okay, so here's our parietal cell, and it's going to release both intrinsic factor and hydrochloric acid. Now, intrinsic factor, this is a protein, okay, that is secreted by the parietal cells, and the role of intrinsic factor is to allow for absorption of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is essential in our diet. It's an essential vitamin. If you remember back, we talked about vitamin B12 in the blood unit, and vitamin B12 is going to help with production of healthy red blood cells, which essentially carry oxygen. And so what intrinsic factor does is it latches onto vitamin B12 when we swallow it, and it protects it from being digested by the stomach. So that's what intrinsic factor does. If we didn't have intrinsic factor, or we're deficient in it, our vitamin B12 would be broken down in our stomach, and then the result of that would be a lack of red blood cell production, and that comes with lack of oxygen transportation, which is an anemia. And if we remember back, that anemia has a name called pernicious anemia. So just kind of putting all those things together, this is where that intrinsic factor is coming from, is the parietal cells. Now the other thing that the parietal cells do produce is hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid is a very strong acid. It makes the acid in the stomach extremely acidic. In fact, the acidity of the stomach is around a pH level of about a 2. But what hydrochloric acid also does is it converts a protein called pepsinogen to pepsin. Okay, pepsinogen to pepsin. So let's take a look at pepsinogen. So pepsinogen comes from the chief cell. It's a protein. And when it comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, it becomes a completely different protein called pepsin. And what pepsin is responsible for, pepsin, P-E-P-S-I-N, is responsible for the breakdown of proteins. Write that down, proteins. Okay. So without pepsin, we're not going to break down, I shouldn't say we won't, but it's going to definitely help break down protein. So where does this pepsin come from again? It was pepsinogen. Pepsinogen came in contact with hydrochloric acid in the stomach. It then became pepsin, and boom, now we can start breaking down proteins. Now, these are our gastric juices. When we talk about gastric juices, we're talking about pepsinogen, hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, even mucus as well. So how do we regulate that? And I'm going to talk about how we stimulate gastric secretions. Instead of inhibiting it, how do we stimulate it? I'm kind of more interested in that here. Obviously, inhibiting would be the opposite of all of this, but there's 3 different phases that would stimulate gastric secretion. So think about these gastric juices we were just talking about. How do we stimulate that? First is the cephalic phase. Remember back to our orientation unit, cephalic means head. So think about you seeing food, you smelling food, the taste or even the thought of food. You're stimulating your central nervous system to start the release of gastric juices. This goes back to receptor control center effector. Your receptors here would be your sense of smell, your eyes for sight, your taste buds, the thought of food. This is telling your brain now you might be prepared to eat. We better get your stomach ready for eating, and therefore it's going to start releasing these gastric juices. And so your effectors here would be all of these cells that we were talking about back here, chief cell, parietal cell, because they're going to release all of these things to get you ready to eat, because it seems like you're ready to eat and your body needs to prepare for that. Now, that's one way. That happens, and then once your food gets to your stomach, then it's called the gastric phase. And you stretch that stomach out, and you start releasing more gastric juices because now the food's actually in your stomach. It's ready to rock and roll. And also, we in the stomach release a hormone called gastrin. And now it's a local hormone, so it's called a paracrine hormone. It's not a hormone that goes throughout your whole entire body. So I do want to use that word hormone fairly loosely, called a paracrine hormone, because it only acts locally. It's called gastrin. And gastrin acts locally to help stimulate the stomach secretions as well. Now that bolus is then going to move to your intestinal phase there, and this is going to begin with a little chyme in the small intestinal tract, and this promotes some gastric emptying as well. Now this is a very short-lived phase. It's not very long-lived, and these stretch receptors will initiate some of that secretion, but again, it's a very short-lived phase, if you will. And that's how we're going to secrete these things. So there's kind of a lot. You got to know what pepsinogen, hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, how are they related? How are they working together or not working at all? Remember the mucus cells, what are they responsible for? Alright, here we are with the General Anatomy and Physiology Digestive System. This is video number 2 for General A&P Blended. And we will start out with the agenda here. This is a pretty short video. We're going to review the stomach and some related issues with that. In our last video, we reviewed the stomach and its anatomical parts and its function. Now we're going to talk about some related issues such as ulcers, gastric bypass surgery, things like that. We'll go and move down into the small and large intestinal tract, and we'll also review accessory structures, which would include the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, and what are the functions of each of those. And then to conclude it, we will review the dietary needs of our body. So we were talking about the stomach in our last video, and here we have what we call a peptic ulcer. You can see that this is in the stomach. Now ulcers are not only found in the stomach. They can be found in your esophagus, in your small or your large intestinal tract. This one happens to be found within the stomach here. And here's a little bit of a much more close-up version of an ulcer. This is done with an endoscopy where they go into your stomach. They clean out your stomach. They take a look at it. They got this under a microscope. You can see the rugae folds all around there. And you can see this ulcer here that's been eating away through the different layers of the stomach. And this will obviously bleed, cause people to be anemic, and make it somewhat painful in their stomach as well. Various reasons for ulcers. It can be anywhere from habits that you have to medications that you're taking to stress. But the number one cause of ulcers is actually a bacteria called H. pylori that resides within the stomach. And it basically corkscrews its way down into the layers of the stomach, and then the acid that we find in the stomach then has contact with this tissue and starts to break down this tissue, if you will, and causes ulcer, which causes bleeding and various different types of effects as well. There's one in the large intestinal tract there. And another thing is GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Now, this is not your typical indigestion that you may have at the dinner table or afterwards. This is something that's more chronic, meaning people have it all the time. I'd say probably about 80 to 90% of my patients that I worked with in the cardiac unit had GERD. And what happens here is we get the sphincter here to relax, and the fluid, the acidic fluid that we find in the stomach, then works its way up through the esophagus, causes the individual to have a lot of indigestion, heart pain, and it's really bothersome for the heart patient because they're not sure if this is their heart or if this is their gastroesophageal reflux disease, and so they have to be on a little bit more of an alert than anybody else, because if it is their heart, they want to get to the hospital immediately. And then we have gastric bypass surgeries. One of my jobs in the hospital for a short period of time was to work with gastric bypass patients, and basically with their exercise program, getting them going before their surgery and then also after their surgery. So we were kind of part of that team, if you will. There's many different types of surgeries that they do for gastric bypass surgery. I'm going to talk about two of them here. This one is probably the most popular. It's called the Roux-en-Y, and you can see that word right up here, Roux-en-Y. And what they do here is they make a little egg sac out of your stomach by stapling it there. As you can see, it's about the size of an egg. So obviously when you have like maybe 2 bites of whatever you're eating, it's going to fill you up. But they also take part of your ileum here, your small intestinal tract, and they bypass the rest of the stomach here. So the food comes down into this little egg sac, it gets digested, and then it works its way down through this bypass part here, and then it works its way into the other portion of the small intestinal tract, where then it can be further broken down by chemicals and then, more importantly, absorbed. This is the most popular one. It has probably the best results immediately. People lose weight very, very fast with this one. But the one thing that downfall for this for people is that it's not reversible. So if they have this done, they can't go back in and take the staples out and have your stomach back. So this is kind of a big deal. In fact, I want you to be aware that this is not something you can walk into the hospital for and sign up. People that are getting ready to have a gastric bypass surgery are literally having a 1-year workup of making sure psychologically they're ready for this, physically they're ready for it, on a nutritional standpoint they're ready to make these changes. Also, you have spouses that may not be participating in a gastric bypass surgery who may be overweight and have the same bad habits. How are they going to deal with that? And then your insurance has to pay for it as well. So this is not something you can walk into the hospital for and think that you're going to get it within a week or two. It's going to take a whole year to be worked up. Make sure you're a good candidate for it. The last thing they want is somebody who is going to not abide, if you will, by the rules of a gastric bypass surgery. Now, I've dealt with many patients with this, and I've seen great success stories. I've seen somebody who was in a wheelchair. She's probably in her mid-40s, upper 40s, and she was in a wheelchair. She couldn't walk. She was so heavy. She was also had a lot of breathing issues with that. She had congestive heart failure. She also had type 2 diabetes, and she no longer was working. Her quality of life was very poor. In fact, she probably didn't have too much longer to live, and she went in to have evaluated for this, and she was a candidate, although she did need to lose about 40 pounds because she was at risk. Even though you might be super heavy, you still have to lose weight in order to be a candidate for gastric bypass surgery. So she lost the weight, She had the surgery. She did fantastic. I ran into her one day. She was working. Didn't even recognize her, obviously, with all the weight loss. But also the fact that she was working now. She said that her congestive heart failure had improved. She no longer had type 2 diabetes because of all the weight loss. And she was obviously up, moving around. Her quality of life was through the roof. And so it's done great things. The only downfall to this is cosmetically afterwards. There's a lot of skin, obviously, with the extra fat that's been lost and the extra skin that's there. And a lot of insurances won't pay for cosmetic surgery, so they have to, obviously maybe dish that out on their own. The other one is called the laparoscopic band surgery. Here it says adjustable gastric band. I'm sure there's other names for it. So it's the same concept where you're making a little egg-shaped pouch with a band, though. Now this is inserted within the body surgically. There's a tube that comes out, a little catheter, and there's a little port. It says subcutaneous, which means it's just underneath the skin there. And there is no bypass here, though. Okay, so there's no major surgery. There's no staples. There's no bypassing any of that. But what that little gastric band does is it acts to control how much you're able to eat in regards to how you're feeling in regards to being full. And then what happens over time is what they do is they stick a needle in here and they push in saline, and the saline goes up in here and then tightens this band. So the doctor has control over this, not the patient, and then the doctor over time will start to relieve some of the fluid from here, the saline, which will release some of the pressure on here and allow this compartment to get bigger. So as you're gradually losing weight, they'll start to take some of that fluid out so that you start to get your stomach back. So you eventually get your stomach back. You'll lose a lot of weight, but it's not as fast as the last one. It's a very gradual weight loss, which for some people that could be a good thing. The only downfall with this, from what I hear, is that there's a higher infection rate with this, which is obviously a very concern. Mechanism of vomiting, there's irritation, so there's some bacteria or some loss of equilibrium of some sort, and so basically the medulla oblongata is going to be where that mechanism of vomiting is called the ometic center. And this is what's basically in the medulla oblongata that is triggering this vomiting, if you will. And basically this just comes down to homeostasis, making sure that whatever is irritating that stomach is back to normal again. So basically all the sphincters that would be found within the esophagus and the stomach are going to, in the small intestinal tract, are going to relax and allow this content to move out. It's called reverse peristalsis there. The small intestinal tract, the functions of it is to chemically digest carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and at the same time absorb those carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. But we have to also understand that the simplest form is what's being absorbed here. So simple sugars for carbohydrates, amino acids for fat, triglycerides for, amino acids for proteins, and triglycerides for fats. And then also water is being absorbed here, and it takes about 3 to 5 hours for digestion. So we have a lot of enzymes working in here. That's the chemical part on carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and then absorption. In fact, the small intestinal tracts are so important that we actually cannot live without them, because we're breaking everything down here, we're absorbing everything as well. So we know about the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. These are our three parts of the small intestinal tract. The duodenum is the shortest, the jejunum is in the middle, and the ileum is the longest. Now, by the time things get down to the ileum, there's not really a whole lot of a breakdown or absorption taking place. Most of the absorption takes place in the duodenum, the jejunum, and that's exactly why we can take the ileum for a gastric bypass surgery right here and use it, because again, by that point it is the longest, and by that point it gets down there, it's pretty much done doing its work. Now, if we opened up the small intestinal tract, it does get a little bit more detailed here. This would be the liner, if you will, of the small intestinal tract, and what we're doing here is like little fingers that have come up, and we're taking that microscopically and we're going to enlarge it right here. Now this right here is called an intestinal villus. Now this is not a cell. The cells would be all around here, making that up. This is just a structure of the small intestinal tract called the intestinal velus. Now, what you'll notice in the middle here, there's this yellow duct, and this is called the lacteal duct, which is part of our lymphatic system. What I want you to know about that is the triglycerides, or fats, are going to be absorbed through the lacteal duct and then transported throughout our body and eventually back into the blood. Then we have a nice capillary bed here, which is going to absorb our simple sugars and our amino acids into our blood, so it can be transported to cells throughout our body. Now, these cells that are making this up right here, if we enlarge that, they would be our simple columnar cells with microvilli on the very top of it to increase surface area. In fact, all of this, the intestinal velus, the microvilli here, the surface area is so significant. If we were to really technically spread this out according to textbooks, they say that it will cover a singles tennis court. That's how much surface area that our small intestinal tract has. Alright, so I think we just covered all this looking at that video. Here's another picture of the intestinal velus as well. Our large intestinal tract is composed of the cecum and the colon, which is our ascending, transverse, descending, and the sigmoid. Then we get to the rectum and then the anal canal. And then finally, remember, we always have a sphincter before and after all of these organs. At the very end, we have the anal sphincter as well. Now, the functions of the large intestinal tract would be absorption as well, but mainly water, electrolytes. Remember, ions or electrolytes, sodium, potassium, chloride, hydrogen, things like that, and then also vitamin K and B. There's still a lot of mucus down here. The whole thing is a mucus-lined membrane. But we also produce a lot of vitamin K and B because bacteria naturally produces some vitamin K and B for us. Now, we can get vitamin K and B from our diet as well, but bacteria will actually synthesize or create it as well. And also, I'm going to just kind of talk briefly about fiber. We all know that fiber is good for us. We hear it. We see it on labels on different things. What fiber does is it acts like a sponge and it absorbs water. Now, why is this good? Well, first of all, it makes you regular. It allows you to go to the bathroom on a regular basis and clear yourself, if you will, which is a good thing because the water is being as the fiber is going through you, it's extracting water from your body and then causing your stool to be loose. Now, we don't absorb fiber. That's very important. It just basically runs right through us. If we have a lot of it, we're going to have a lot of water then coming out, which would lead to diarrhea. And if we don't have enough fiber, we're going to have constipation. So a good balance of fiber is ideal. Now, what's a daily recommended dose of fiber? 25 to 30 grams per day. Most Americans, though, are getting about 5 to 10 grams because where do you find most of your fiber? Fruits, vegetables, things like that, which obviously we're probably not eating enough of. The cecum is the bag area there in the beginning of the colon, and remember that the appendix is attached to it. It's called the vermiform appendix. Vermiform means worm, and here is a picture of an appendix. Now, this is appendicitis. This is an appendix that is inflamed. Technically, it should look like this pink that we see right here, and you can see how inflamed that needs to be coming out. That's causing a lot of pain, discomfort, and we don't want that to burst. If it does, whatever's in there is going to leak into that very sterile body cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity, and cause an infection. Now, the digestion through here is about anywhere from 18 to 24 hours roughly. It'll just move its way through there, but movement through there is a little bit different. We have what we call mass movements, where larger areas of our colon will contract at one time. So it's a little bit different than the peristalsis that we've been talking about. This is usually going to happen after a meal, which is very common, which is going to allow you to, basically it's getting your body ready for the next round of food, if you will. It's part of homeostasis, right? And then you have the defecation reflex, where your rectum becomes distended, and that causes the sensation to go to your brain that you are ready to defecate. And obviously with defecation, we know that we do have to create some abdominal pressure there to defecate our fecal matter out. And feces, the composition of, is obviously anything that we didn't digest. We do have intestinal cells that are being sloughed off, kind of like our skin. We have 30% of the dried weight is bacteria. We have bile, mucus, and water. And now, the composition of fecal matter could change. If you're dehydrated, whether you're overhydrated, too much fiber, there's so many variables in there that would play a role in what your fecal matter is composed of. And then we have our accessory organs. Now remember, accessory organs are organs that the bolus or the food does not pass through. So we talked about salivary glands already, so I'm not going to go back to that. But we'll talk about the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And before we do that, we do have some ducts that are going to be opening up to allow for the digestive juices, if you will, that are coming from the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder to be released from. There is an area called the major duodenum papilla, and if we look on this picture here, just kind of point out what we're looking at. Here's your gallbladder. Your liver would be up here, which we don't see. Here's your stomach, and then here's your pancreas. Right where the common bile duct comes down and the pancreatic comes, right where they merge together into this duodenum, this is called the duodenum papilla right there, and that's where everything is going to be released from your pancreas, from your gallbladder, and from your liver. So it's kind of like a port of entry, if you will, something to probably talk about and just mention, so we know that everything's going into the duodenum. In regards to secretions into that duodenum, we have the pancreas, which has enzymes that will digest all of our macromolecules, carbs, proteins, and fats. Intestinal secretions such as water, mucus, and electrolytes. We also have bile from the liver and the gallbladder. And remember, bile is used for dietary fat breakdown, not breakdown to its simplest form, though. Contrary to that, it's called emulsification. So basically taking a big fat droplet and breaking it down into smaller fat droplets. And so bile is not an enzyme. That's very important. Bile is just a chemical that's going to help take a larger fat molecule and break it down to smaller fat molecules. And then what you have is you have enzymes that come in and break those fat molecules down into the simplest form, which is something that we can absorb. So very important to understand that emulsification is that process of fat breakdown, but not to its simplest form, and bile is not, I repeat, is not an enzyme. Here is the liver. This is your largest internal organ. As you can see here, not really a whole lot to talk about. In advanced A&P, they'll get a little bit more detailed with its anatomy and physiology. As far as its functions go, though, a big one for this unit is bile secretion, and knowing that bile emulsifies fat. It is a gatekeeper of blood, meaning that it removes toxins, so it detoxifies our blood. It produces plasma proteins and clotting factors. So when we were looking at cardiovascular system and all of the different Roman numerals that are involved with the clotting process, this is where they come from. It also stores a large amount of glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose, and so we can break that down and use it when our reserves of glucose are low. And it also breaks down and recycles some of our red blood cells. The gallbladder's job is to store extra bile and then eventually release it. It does not produce bile, it just stores it, so it comes from the liver, stores it, releases it when we need it. So we can live without our gallbladder, unlike our liver, and we get rid of our gallbladder. It's called a cholecystectomy. And here's a picture of gallstones that you can see here. Now, gallstones are 80% of them are due to cholesterol buildup, and another 20% of them are usually the result of pigments. And we really have to understand what bile is, and I believe we'll talk about it here in a little bit, but that's usually the cause of gallstones. Now this is pretty bad there, and those aren't going to leave the gallbladder, but they are going to cause the gallbladder to get inflamed and painful, and the fact that you're going to need to have that thing taken out. So let's just kind of talk a little bit about bile here. It's yellow-greenish color, delivered to the duodenum from the liver and the gallbladder. We know that it emulsifies or breaks down fat. It also, this is very important, it's kind of under the radar, neutralizes and dilutes chyme. Remember, chyme is that acidic, pasty stuff that we find in the stomach. And so what happens is when that mixes with the chyme, this bile mixes with the chyme, it neutralizes that mixture so the enzymes can work on our food, and which is obviously what we want. We want to break down our food. So without bile, that's going to be very difficult because the environment will be very acidic. Here's the composition of it. Cholesterol, remember I said 80% of all gallstones are from cholesterol buildup. Bile salts, pigments, there's that 20% from pigments that we would find in there as well. The pancreas is behind the stomach, and it is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. And it does have a pancreatic duct that runs through it. Now, as an exocrine, remember exocrine means that it does have a duct with it, and that would be the pancreatic duct. And this is how all of those enzymes are released into the duodenum, is through this pancreatic duct. And remember that these enzymes help break down all of our macronutrients, carbs, proteins, and fats, so therefore we cannot live without our pancreas for this reason alone right there. Bottom one. Boom. Now this is as an exocrine. Now as an endocrine, remember endocrine, endo means hormone. So we've talked about this already, but insulin is a hormone that comes from the beta cells of the pancreas, and glucagon comes from the alpha cells. So what are each of these hormones going to do? Well, insulin is going to bring your blood sugars down, whereas glucagon will bring your blood sugars up. Okay, so again, both of these hormones are going to regulate your blood glucose levels as an endocrine gland. And finally, our major food groups, we have macronutrients, which would be our proteins, our carbs, and our fats, and our water. You can see where we would get each of those from. Micronutrients would be our minerals and vitamins. We don't talk a lot about that. We don't have a lot of time to do that. But they act as like coenzymes to help other enzymes, if you will, do their work. And we do have essential vitamins and minerals that we absolutely need in our body, which we'll save for a different day or a different class. And chemical digestion. If we look at what's going to break down all of our carbohydrates chemically, amylase in our saliva and also the pancreatic juices or enzymes will help break down our carbohydrates. As far as proteins go, in the stomach, gastric, pepsin. Remember, pepsin breaks down proteins, and then pancreatic enzymes do the same. Fats, pancreatic enzymes, and then bile. But remember, bile doesn't break it down to its simplest form, but instead breaks it down to a little bit more manageable so the enzymes can work on it. Remember, emulsification. So the end products then, again, if we go from carbohydrates to simple sugars, proteins to amino acids, lipids to triglycerides or fatty acids. And finally, the food pyramid. I just wanted to show you this. You can see that they added the exercise portion into it. Notice that they have all of the different daily recommended doses. Notice the yellow fats and sugars here. They don't actually have anything listed down here because they want to mention it but not make a big deal out of it. Also, if you look at all the grains, there are a lot of brown whole wheat grains here, which has more fiber in it, which would keep you more satisfied. That's the other thing with fibers. It keeps you more satisfied throughout the day, so you're not wanting more food. And so you don't see any of that white stuff there, white grains, if you will. So this is kind of the new My Pyramid thing that I talk about. So this will help you with your exam on the digestive system. If you have any questions, you know where to reach me. Have a good day.